The report on Sri Lanka by the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights, Michelle Bachelet, was submitted yesterday. The advanced unedited version of the report comes with the 49th session of the UN Human Rights Council set to get underway on the 28th of February, running through to the 1st of April. The latest written update is submitted pursuant to Human Rights Council Resolution 46/1. The report says that the UN Human Rights Chief remains concerned about the continued lack of accountability for past human rights violations and recognition of victims' rights in Sri Lanka, particularly those stemming from the conflict that ended in 2009. At the same time, Bachelet also recognizes what the report calls the recent signs of renewed openness of the government in engaging with the Office of the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights and the initial steps taken to initiate some reforms. The UN Human Rights Chief meanwhile accuses that in the last 2 years, the independence of the judiciary, the Human Rights Commission and other key institutions have been eroded and democratic space, including for human rights advocacy, constricted. There is also accusation that there has been a further drift towards militarization and an emphasis of Sinhala nationalism and Buddhism in state institutions being more visible, increasing the marginalization and uncertainty of minority communities, undermining reconciliation. The report also notes that there's a risk of the economic downturn further fueling what Bachelet calls the prevailing marginalization and discrimination against minority communities. She also recommends that the Human Rights Council continue to pursue international strategies for accountability in the absence of tangible results that ensure justice for victims. In her recommendations, the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights calls on the Sri Lankan government to ensure that the drafting process for a new constitution is based on broad and inclusive consultations, entrenches the independence of judiciary and key national institutions such as the HRCSL, and advances the devolution of political authority. She also wants the government to avoid reliance on the military to run civilian affairs and take steps to reduce the influence of the military on civilian life. It is also recommended that the findings of the Commission of Inquiry into the 2019 Easter Sunday bombings be published to ensure transparency for victims and pursue further independent investigations into the involvement of any other state or non-state actors. Further, fundamental reforms to the Prevention of Terrorism Act is also urged, while calling for a moratorium on the use of the PTA until it is replaced by legislation that fully complies with international human rights norms and standards. The expediting of the review of all detainees held under the PTA and the release of everyone detained without sufficient legal and evidentiary basis is also called for. The UN High Commissioner for Human Rights also wants member states of the UNHRC to cooperate with victims and their representatives to investigate and prosecute international crimes committed by all parties in Sri Lanka through judicial proceedings in domestic jurisdictions, including under accepted principles of extraterritorial or universal jurisdictions, and continue to explore possible targeted sanctions against credibly alleged perpetrators of grave human rights violations and abuses. On the United Nations peacekeeping front, Bachelet recommends that the contributions of Sri Lanka to United Nations peacekeeping operations and the system for screening Sri Lankan personnel be reviewed.